Oh, my dear friends, just think about it. A flicker of hope emerging from a tiny village while the world was in chaos, in the midst of war. Today, we're going to talk about a young girl who, with her faith, changed the destiny of a nation. A girl who believed she was God's messenger and gave up everything for that belief, Jeanne d'Arc, or as you might know her, Joan of Arc. The flames of the 100 Years' War were tearing Europe apart, and France was in a deep crisis. The land was divided, the king's rule was uncertain, and the people were drowning in despair. And in this dark time, from the rural village of Domrémy in Lorraine, a simple shepherd girl stepped forward. She claimed to hear the voice of God and, against all odds, left an indelible mark on French history. But this story isn't just about battles, political schemes, or a tragic ending. It's about faith being tested, about someone achieving the impossible through sheer courage. It's a legend that even centuries later still captivates people. So, let's step into the world of this extraordinary woman and discover how her story began. Are you ready, my friends? It all started in that little village. Ah, my friends, just imagine it. We're traveling back in time to find ourselves in the chaos of medieval France. It's the 1420s. The lands of France are in ruins. Villages are eerily quiet except for the stomping boots of raiding soldiers. Fear and uncertainty are etched onto the faces of the people. A nation, it seems, is tearing itself apart. But this isn't just any war story. This is one of the darkest chapters in the 100 Years' War, a conflict that shaped the destinies of kings and nations alike. France, though it looked like one country on the map, was really a fractured mosaic. In the north, English forces were riding high on their victories, occupying vast swaths of French land. To the west and east, the powerful Duchy of Burgundy loomed large, not exactly allied with France or England, but instead playing its own cunning game. Burgundy at the time was the very symbol of betrayal, political maneuvering, and self-interest. Like a sneaky queen on a chessboard, Burgundy switched sides whenever it suited its goals, sometimes supporting France, other times England. This two-faced strategy pushed France to the brink of both military and political collapse. The 100 Years' War was both a symptom and a cause of this chaos. It wasn't just a simple border dispute between France and England. At its core, it was a battle of identity and ambition, a clash between two nations and their rulers' insatiable desire for dominance. The English had claimed the French throne and achieved significant victories. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 was a crushing English triumph. As French knights fell one by one to English longbowmen, the French people sank deeper into despair. Faith in their king waned, and much of their homeland was now under enemy control. In northern France, another throne had been set up under English rule. Charles de Valois, the rightful heir, wasn't recognized by Burgundy, and the dream of national unity was fading fast in the eyes of the people. They watched as their lords and dukes seemed more concerned with their own power than the well-being of their nation. Taxes grew heavier, and instead of the comforting smell of bread baking in village ovens, the air was filled with the bitter cries of hunger and hopelessness. But the biggest blow was the loss of faith. Faith in their leaders, faith in the future. And then there was Burgundy. Burgundy was like a dagger to France's heart. Sometimes it backed France, other times it turned to England. betraying France outright. The breaking point came in 1419 with a shocking act of violence. Jeanne sans peur, or John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, was assassinated by Charles de Valois' men. That moment shattered any remaining trust between France and Burgundy. When Burgundy allied itself with England against France, the situation became even more dire. But, my friends, let's not forget this. History has a way of lighting a spark in its darkest moments. Even as hope seemed to fade for the people of France, something was beginning to stir in the battlefields and in the hearts of the people. Despite the civil wars, betrayals, and looming enemy forces, the seeds of resistance and courage were being planted in the soul of France. So, how would France emerge from this dark age? Who would turn the wheel of history and rally the scattered pieces of this fractured land? There's so much more to tell. Ah, my dear friends, let me take you to the quiet, serene countryside of northeastern France, to a small village called Domrémy. The year is 1412. As the chaos and gloom of the 100 Years' War swept through the country like a raging storm, it was here, in a green valley surrounded by oak trees, that a child was born. At first glance, she seemed like just another member of a humble peasant family. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a farmer. Her mother, Isabel, was a deeply devout woman with strong ties to the church. Like most villagers, they lived a modest life, placing their hopes in the land they worked and the prayers they offered. But, oh my friends, this little girl was no ordinary child. She was born into a destiny that would shape the future. Her name was Jeanne, and fate had something extraordinary in store for her. Jeanne's childhood unfolded amidst the idyllic beauty of Domrémy. Her days were spent tending sheep, working in the fields, and praying alongside her mother. It was as if nature itself had woven peace into the fabric of her life. Wandering the forest's edge with her flock, she seemed to listen intently to the whispers of the wind, gazing skyward as though she could touch a world beyond what we can see. Her neighbors knew her as quiet and thoughtful, never suspecting she would one day alter the course of French history. Gradually, the innocence of childhood gave way to a growing sense of purpose within Jeanne. By the time she was 13, she experienced something that would change her life forever. It was an ordinary afternoon. The sun shone brightly, casting light over the hills and valleys of Domrémy. Jeanne had taken refuge under the shade of a tree, silently praying. Then, suddenly, it was as if the world stopped. She looked up, startled by an unfamiliar feeling. In her ears, it wasn't the sound of the wind, but a melodic voice that echoed. Jeanne was stunned. She later described it as a vision, but not just any vision. Saints appeared before her, carrying a divine message from God. They told her she had been chosen to save France, to end the English occupation. It was clear that these weren't mere dreams of a child. Jeanne's transformation was proof enough. From that moment, it was as though a seed of courage had been planted in her heart. The quiet shepherdess of Domrémy began to radiate an unshakable determination, fueled by unwavering faith. More visions followed, each reinforcing her mission to present herself to King Charles VII, help him reclaim his throne, and liberate France from England's grasp. But think about it, my friends. Who would believe such a young girl, a mere peasant, with such a divine purpose? Even her own family was skeptical when she spoke of her heavenly mission. Yet, something in her words, her sincerity, her conviction, the fire in her eyes, began to touch the hearts of a few. Still, Jeanne's divine journey was a secret she carried, shared only between her and God. Many trials, doubts, and rejections awaited her. For the little shepherdess of Domrémy, this was just the beginning of a remarkable journey. So, my friends, could a young girl armed with nothing but her faith really change the fate of an entire nation? Who would stand by her and who would try to stop her? Jeanne's story of courage and faith doesn't end here. It's only just beginning. Oh, my dear friends, it's like a cry was echoing through the quiet valleys of Domrémy. But this wasn't a cry of fear or despair. No, this was the shout of faith and determination. And the one behind that cry? None other than a young shepherd girl named Jeanne. Ever since she was a child, she'd been having these divine visions, and they didn't just light a spark in her soul, they ignited a blazing fire. Not just any fire, this was a holy torch meant to carry God's message to the world. She might have seemed fragile, even small, but her spirit, it was unshakable, like a fortress. This moment marked a turning point in her life, not just a story of faith, but the tale of a heart filled with hope for an entire nation. After experiencing those visions, Jeanne fully embraced the profound message she'd been given. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret kept appearing to her with the same command: "You will free France from the grip of the English invaders." Sure, she was born a peasant, but as they told her, what mattered to God wasn't who she was. It was what she was capable of achieving. They urged her to go to King Charles VII and set France on the path to liberation. At first, this idea shook her family and community. I mean, who was this girl to carry the fate of a whole nation on her shoulders? But oh, my friends, never forget this. True faith, pure and unwavering, can overcome any obstacle. Jeanne started by telling her family about her visions and divine mission. Her mother, Isabel, tried to protect her, thinking it was just a child's imagination running wild. Her father, on the other hand, was deeply worried. Any action against England or the Burgundians could bring harsh consequences. But Jeanne didn't back down. Every step she took on those narrow paths from her village to the nearby towns only strengthened her resolve. Each time she knelt in prayer, her belief grew stronger. She wasn't just a dreamer from her village, she was God's messenger, and refusing this mission was simply not an option. Ah, but this wasn't an easy journey, my friends. Following her visions, Jeanne approached a local lord, asking for his support. Explaining who she was and why she was there wasn't simple. A peasant girl asking to see the king, who would take her seriously. But as Jeanne spoke, there was something about her, a light, a conviction, that made it impossible to dismiss her. Her words didn't come from the experience of a wise, learned woman, but from the burning passion of a true believer. Some soldiers and noblemen in the area hesitated to send Jeanne to King Charles VII's court, but her courage and unwavering faith started to resonate with people. To some, she was just a delusional girl. To others, she seemed like a true saint. Eventually, her determination paid off, and a group agreed to bring her to the king. But that was just the beginning. Jeanne's battles weren't only against the enemy, they were also against doubt and disbelief. So, my friends, how did a simple village girl transform into God's messenger and earn the king's trust? How did she rally her people and lead them toward freedom? Was she truly ready to bear the weight of this divine mission? Or would the challenges ahead test her faith and resolve? Those are the answers we'll uncover together. Oh, my dear friends, imagine this:
a humble peasant girl, her head covered, leaving behind the rocky paths where she once herded sheep, embarking on a journey destined to carve her name into history. This wasn't just any journey, it was a walk filled with fears and doubts. And at the end of it, this frail girl was determined to stand before the man who was not yet crowned king, but who still shone like a beacon of hope for France in its darkest days, Charles VII. But, my friends, behind the grand walls of the royal court, Jeanne wasn't just met with a ruler's welcome. No, there were doubts, sneers, and the lingering question in everyone's mind. Could she really be carrying a message from God? The journey was riddled with dangers. It was the harsh winter of 1429, and war had left every corner of France in ruins. English and Burgundian forces patrolled the roads. Every turn was a potential trap, every path shrouded in uncertainty. Accompanied by a small band of brave men, Jeanne pressed on under the shadow of skeptical gazes. In the villages and towns they passed through, people whispered at first, then stared in timid awe. Some dismissed her as a delusional dreamer. Others searched her face for signs of divine grace. And Jeanne? For her, every step was a prayer, every breath a vow. God will protect me, she whispered to herself, clinging tightly to that belief. After days of grueling travel, they finally arrived at Chinon, the grand castle where the king resided. Now just imagine, for a young girl who had never seen anything beyond her small village, how intimidating those towering gates must have seemed. Yet Jeanne's steps didn't falter. In fact, she grew even more resolute. Nothing waiting for her on the other side could make her abandon her mission. Inside the castle, Jeanne was met not only by Charles, but by a court full of skeptical onlookers. At first glance, there was little reason to believe in her. She was short, plainly dressed, and her voice was far softer than one might expect from a leader of armies. But appearances, dear friends, can be deceiving. In Jeanne's eyes burned an unyielding fire, a fire so intense that anyone who looked into them knew she was carrying a burden far beyond what any ordinary person could bear. Jeanne demanded to see the king directly, but of course it wasn't that simple. Charles's advisors were quick to dismiss her, insisting she wasn't to be taken seriously. After all, was France truly so desperate that it would place its hope in a peasant girl? To them, Jeanne was either an opportunist or teetering on the edge of madness. Yet Charles, unable to suppress his curiosity, agreed to meet her, but not without a test. That evening, a plan was set in motion. A decoy, dressed as the king, would take his place in the grand hall, while Charles himself stood quietly in the crowd. If Jeanne was truly sent by God, she would know the real king. Oh, my friends, when Jeanne stepped into that hall, it was as if she was drawn straight to the true Charles, like a magnet. Ignoring the crowd, she knelt before him and said, "God has shown me who you are." The room fell silent, a wave of astonishment washing over everyone present. In that moment, the armor of doubt began to crack. But for Charles, this alone wasn't enough. If Jeanne truly was God's messenger, she would have to prove it. And for that, the court and the people would need a real victory, something undeniable. Now, think about it, dear friends. After facing the intrigues of the court and Charles' questioning gaze, how would Jeanne turn her dream of saving France into reality? Could this young girl truly bring about the miracle that would rally her people? Join me in the next chapter as we search for the answers to these questions together. Ah, my dear friends, now close your eyes and picture this. It's the year 1429. France is shivering under the dark shadow of war and despair. The English have laid siege to Orleans, determined to drain the soul of the French people. In this ancient city, only a handful of defenders are trapped behind the walls, their hope long gone. Days and months pass, each hour sinking the French further into a deep, endless nightmare. But in the middle of this gloom, like a lightning bolt in a dark night, a young peasant girl arrives, and hope begins to sprout. This girl is none other than Joan of Arc. When Joan neared Orleans, the English dismissed her arrival. To them, this young girl was just a symbol of France's exhausted resources, ordinary, worthless, maybe even a little crazy. But my friends, Joan wasn't carrying an army, weapons, or gold. Her only weapon was her unshakable faith. The moment she entered the city gates, the slowly dying hope among the French defenders reignited with a spark. Joan was a source of unprecedented confidence. She spoke, moved, and planned with a courage no one could even imagine. She even boldly expressed her ideas in war councils where only nobles were usually allowed, and she said they would win through the divine mission given to her. Orleans will be free again, Joan declared. God is with us. Those words echoed like a rallying cry in the soldiers' hearts. Throughout the siege, Joan took on both physical and spiritual leadership. She appeared in front of the trenches like a shining flag in the chaos of the battlefield, fearlessly moving among the soldiers, shouting words of encouragement. Her unstoppable energy even astonished the commanders. After all, this young girl, who had left her village to take on this task alone, was doing what many nobles didn't even have the courage to attempt. The turning point in Orleans came when the French launched their massive attack. Under Joan's command, the French soldiers weren't just armed with weapons, they were armed with the faith they had regained. When the English realized they were facing not just an army, but the courage of a revived nation, their resistance started to crumble. As the French advanced wave after wave, Joan stood at the front with her banner. Even when she was struck by an arrow, she didn't retreat. Despite losing blood, she yelled out to the soldiers fighting at the walls, "God is with us, never retreat." That moment was one of the most unforgettable in that battle. And finally, at the end of that long and exhausting day, the siege of Orleans was broken. The English, suffering a historic defeat, began to retreat. As the victory cries of the French echoed through the city walls, the people hailed Joan as a true hero. That day, my friends, wasn't just the end of a siege. It was the day the belief that Joan was God's messenger spread throughout France, and the people's confidence was restored. So, did Joan's victory in Orleans mark a turning point? Was this victory enough to start the process of freeing all of France from enemy occupation? Well, my friends, we'll look for the answers to that question in the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, let's remember those glorious days together. After the victory at Orleans, Joan of Arc had become not just a hero, but also a shining beacon of hope in the heart of the nation. But you know, this was just the beginning. Joan had only taken the first step of her dream to fully liberate France. A moment had come when her eyes were set on the next big goal, Rheims, because Rheims was the place where that sacred ceremony would determine France's true destiny. There, King Charles VII would be crowned, and God's will would officially come to life. And for Joan, this was a task given to her directly by God. After the great victory at Orleans, one thing became clear to Joan and those who believed in her vision. France needed a true leader. But my friends, This leader couldn't just be someone by name or lineage. They needed to gain legitimacy in the eyes of the people through God's blessing. That's why, at Joan's suggestion, all eyes were turned to Reims. Reaching this city, which was under English occupation at the time, wasn't going to be easy. Much of France was still under enemy control. The roads were filled with dangers, and there were many people who were skeptical of Joan's miracles. But Joan, speaking with the voice of God inside her, urged the doubtful to find courage and faith. The Dauphin Charles initially hesitated to embark on this journey. Many in the royal court saw the young peasant girl's leadership as madness. But Joan's determination shattered his doubts. It's said that one day Joan approached Charles, looked into his eyes, and cried out, "I swear you're the king, and we will go to Reims and crown you in God's name." That moment sparked something inside Charles, and the divine faith in this young girl broke down the walls of doubt. As the French army and Joan set off towards Reims, they weren't just marching to battle. They were stepping into a journey that would reshape the fate of a nation. This journey was far from easy. In every land they passed, enemy ambushes, hunger, and the fear of the people awaited them. But interestingly, Joan's presence wasn't just inspiring the soldiers. Even the common people were mesmerized. From villages and towns, crowds filled the roads to watch her pass, whispering, "Here comes God's messenger." Slowly but steadily, the army overcame the enemy resistance it encountered. Finally, the walls of Reims appeared. The people of the city chose not to resist. They believed that this army, under Joan's leadership, was fulfilling God's will. The city gates opened, and the French army entered Reims with a victorious air. And then, that historic moment, the coronation ceremony inside Reims Cathedral. As Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France, Joan quietly prayed during the ceremony. This was the moment she had seen in her visions, the moment of a nation's rebirth. The coronation didn't just make Charles a king, it gave France an identity. But my friends, you know this story doesn't end here, right? Because being crowned was just the beginning. The English were still a threat, and Joan still had a difficult path ahead of her. What challenges would the young heroine face after the victory at Reims? What fate awaited this girl chosen by God? Come, let's search for the answers to these questions in the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, sometimes even the brightest stars in history lose their shine in the sky. While fate had written pages full of magnificent victories for Joan of Arc, we mustn't forget that her story wasn't just filled with triumphs, but also with downfalls. This young peasant girl, once hailed as France's savior, was now beginning to face a harsher reality after her great victories. People's faith is as changeable as the wind. The crowning of Charles VII in Reims was a turning point for the people, but for Joan, that glorious moment wasn't the end of the road. It was only the herald of new challenges. Joan believed that as long as she led the armies, she could completely change France's destiny. But inside the royal court, different winds were blowing. After officially becoming king, Charles VII began to think that Joan's role was over. Joan's rise had cast such a large shadow that it was unsettling to some at court. The king's self-serving advisors whispered that Joan was now unnecessary, and they filled the space left by her success with doubts. Sadly, my friends, it seems that sometimes people try to extinguish the brightest star with their own hands. Joan, however, tried to ignore her fall in the eyes of the people. For her, the war was far from over. the English still ruled the northern lands of France, especially Paris. This ancient city was under the grip of invaders, and in Joan's visions, it felt like a sacred mission to liberate it. Despite the king's hesitations and lack of support, Joan was determined. Her faith remained unshaken. She was certain that with God's guidance, Paris could once again be brought into the heart of France. But this time, Joan had to fight not only the enemy, but also the allies who had turned their backs on her. The campaign for Paris was like a storm. Joan, wearing her famous white armor, once again found herself at the front of the army. As they advanced towards the city walls, she guided her soldiers with courage, as always. However, it was clear to everyone that the English and the Burgundians were determined to hold on to this key city. The resistance behind the walls was brutal. The enemy was not only strong physically, but also strategically opposing Joan and her army. And then that fateful day came. The siege of Paris ended in complete failure. Joan had been a beacon of hope for her soldiers up until that day. But when she was wounded by arrows during the siege, the morale of the army was deeply shaken. Though she didn't want to retreat, the king's order to end the war was given, and Joan was forced to accept the defeat she never wished for. After this event, Joan's influence at court began to wane, and those who wished to see her fall seemed to have won. The people of France began to lose their belief in the miracle she had brought. And worst of all, Joan was now surrounded not just by the English, but also by the political intrigues of her own country. Ah, my dear friends, who deserves such a fate? No matter how strong Joan's faith was, the obstacles before her grew with each passing day. So, despite everything, could this young woman, who claimed to be God's servant, stop her downfall once again? What fate awaited her behind the next door? Come, let's seek the answers to these questions together in the next chapter. Ah, my dear friends, let me take you to one of the most dramatic turning points in history. In the life of Joan of Arc, a symbol of courage and faith, nothing would ever be the same after that dark day. In the sorrow-filled squares of Compiègne, the shadows of both victory and betrayal were intertwining. And unfortunately, this time, Joan's light would be defeated by the dark intentions of those who followed her. It was the spring of 1430. Joan, with her unshakable faith and courage, was still fighting for France's liberation, playing her last cards against the relentless enemy. Compiègne, a fortress city in northern France, had strategic importance. The forces of the Duchy of Burgundy and the English army wanted to capture this small city and completely crush France's defenses. Joan, however, still believed that God was guiding her, and she aimed to give her people hope with a great victory in Compiègne. But fate had a different path in store for her. Ah, my dear friends, on that morning, Joan was once again at the front lines of the army, wearing her white armor and holding the holy banner. You could feel her determination in every part of her being as she gazed at her soldiers preparing for battle. However, the attack on Compiègne had been carefully set up as a trap from the beginning. During the French assault, Joan and her loyal warriors found themselves in a position surrounded by Burgundian forces. They had been lured away from the city walls and into the open, and this quickly turned into a disaster. As the Burgundian forces advanced, Joan was forced to retreat with her soldiers. But unfortunately, this retreat was anything but a tactical maneuver. It was a chaotic flight. The Burgundians closed the gates of Compiègne, cutting off the escape route to the city. In that moment, Joan, without a second thought, turned back and tried to help her soldiers. Without regard for her own life, she did everything she could to help the fleeing warriors reach the city walls. But in the chaos of the battlefield, she found herself completely surrounded by the enemy. Joan's capture was a heart-wrenching moment. When she was thrown from her horse, her sword taken away, and her holy banner seized by the enemy, it was a devastating loss. The young woman fought back. With the strength she believed God had given her, she kept fighting to free herself. But the winds of fate were no longer in her favor. Her belief in her invincibility had been overshadowed in that moment. The Burgundian soldiers captured her and took her to a secure area. In her eyes at that moment, there was no fear nor despair, just a kind of calm, perhaps the surrender to her destiny. Compiègne marked a turning point in Joan's journey. Her capture didn't just open a dark chapter for her, it also revealed a shadow over France's struggle. When word of her capture spread, the people were horrified. The young woman they saw as God's chosen one was now in the hands of the Burgundians, and everyone knew that Burgundy would sell Joan a priceless prize to the English. But now, I'm sure, like me, you're wondering, my dear friends, could Joan, now in the hands of the Burgundians, despite all hope, still escape? Or would the English set their treacherous plans in motion to silence her for good? I can't wait to explore the secrets that await us on her difficult journey in captivity. Let's continue her journey together in the next chapter as we unravel the twists of fate. Ah, my dear listeners, now we move into the darkest and most merciless period of Joan's life. This was a time when her courage and faith were put to the harshest of tests, and the dignity of humanity sank to its lowest depths. Joan of Arc, a hero of a nation, seen as a messenger of God, was now a prisoner in the hands of her enemies. They would use every trick and form of pressure to weaken her, silence her, and stain her holiness in the eyes of the people. But Joan, with the faith and will she carried in her delicate body, would challenge this hardship. After being captured by the Burgundians in Compiègne, Joan had fallen into the hands of the English. To them, Joan was not only an enemy, but a symbol that ignited the hearts of the people. They wanted to solidify England's control over France, but Joan's victories and her place in the hearts of the people were the greatest obstacles to that goal. They wanted to kill her, yes, but a simple execution wouldn't suffice. They had to show her not as a hero in the eyes of the people, but as a heretic, a disruptor of the divine order. And so, the trial they set up for her wasn't a fair trial. It was a theater of discredit. In the city of Rouen, she began to be judged by a court under English control. Leading the tribunal was Pierre Cochon, a clergyman loyal to England. Joan's fate had been sealed even before the trial began. But for this theater to be convincing, they had to break her will. They tried to wear her down with interrogations, leading questions, and constant pressure. But Joan answered simply and powerfully. She shouted that God had appointed her and that there was nothing wrong in the mission he had given her. Her unwavering faith drove the members of the court to madness. One of the main accusations against Joan was that she wore men's clothing. In those times, women wearing men's clothes was seen as heresy by the church. But Joan explained that she wore these clothes to move more freely on the battlefield and to protect herself. She also openly said that she needed these clothes to avoid being harassed by male guards during her captivity. However, the court was not interested in hearing these reasonable explanations. To them, Joan wearing these clothes was enough to justify it as an offense against God's order. Throughout the trial, her visions and messages from God were also questioned. They asked her who these messages came from, whether they were truly from angels or from the devil. Joan repeatedly insisted that these visions were holy, a gift from God. Yet, the court twisted her statements to make her appear as a witch or a servant of the devil in the eyes of the people. During the days and weeks of this trial, Joan was subjected to both physical and psychological torture. She was kept in a dungeon, her hands and feet chained. The court, trying to wear her down and force her to speak against herself, pushed her to the brink. But despite all the pressure, Joan never wavered from her faith and her story. Her unwavering stance only enraged her enemies further. And finally, my dear friends, the court declared Joan to be a heretic. They found her guilty, but remember, this wasn't a real trial. It was a staged performance from start to finish. But did this verdict truly seal Joan's fate? Or would her will and faith leave behind a legacy that would turn her enemies' plans upside down? In the next chapter, we'll see the tragic outcome of Joan's dark trial and how history would carve a different path for her. Now, let's slowly approach that pile of wood rising in the square of Rouen. Ah, my dear listeners, in the cruel cycle of life, sometimes the brightest lights fade in the darkest shadows. There was a silent tension echoing through the stone streets of Rouen that morning. The sky was covered in a gray blanket, as if nature itself felt the weight of the impending tragedy. The crowd had gathered around the square, filled with curiosity and fear, their eyes fixed on the path that the young woman would walk. Joan of Arc, chained, was moving forward with the heavy steps of a prisoner. Yet there was no fear or desperation in her face. Instead, her eyes shone with deep faith and unwavering determination. The execution set by the English in the heart of Rouen was not only about ending one person's life, but also about extinguishing the hope of an entire nation. After Joan was found guilty, the court sentenced her to be burned at the stake. This punishment, the harshest for those accused of heresy, was meant to not only destroy Joan's body, but also to burn away all the values she represented. But how ironic it is, dear friends, that this fire would only consume Joan's physical presence. Her spirit and legacy would rise from these flames even more powerfully. That morning, Joan's removal from her prison felt less like the walk of a prisoner and more like the sacred ritual of a saint. The clinking of her chains pierced the silence of the square, and with each step, something within the hearts of the crowd seemed to break. Despite her hands being bound, Joan held her head high. Some wept, others turned their eyes away. Yet Joan's stance shook even the guilt and helplessness in the hearts of the crowd. It was as if she walked with a grace that didn't belong to this world. The pile of wood rising in the center of the square seemed more like an altar than a place of execution in the eyes of the crowd. When Joan was led to the site, she said a short prayer. Her eyes turned to the sky, her voice calm but resolute. She said that God had brought her this far, and now she would surrender herself to Him. The English soldiers and church officials were uneasy with her demeanor, and without a moment's hesitation, they prepared to light the fire. They had realized that even in her final moments, Joan was increasing her holiness in the eyes of the people, and at last the fire began to rise around Joan. As the smoke curled into the sky, the crowd holding its breath, Joan's voice rose through the flames like a prayer. "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," she cried out. These final words were a reflection of her faith and surrender. As the flames enveloped Joan's body, in the eyes of the crowd, she was no longer a criminal, but a saint. After this tragic event, Joan's ashes were scattered into the Seine River. The English had not wanted her to leave any trace behind. But, dear friends, can destroying a person's physical remains erase their spirit and memory? Of course not. Joan's death turned her into a hero, a saint, and a legend in the eyes of the people. Prayers were said in her name, and her stories began to be told. France would never forget her sacrifice, and years later, Joan of Arc would be canonized by the Church, honored as a sacred servant of God. But what were the long-term effects of this event? How did Joan's death change the fate of France? And though her ashes seemed to disappear into the Seine, how did these flames reignite the spirit of a nation? Well, dear friends, in the next chapter, we will explore how Joan's legacy became eternal and how she became a symbol for France on its path to independence. Ah, my dear listeners, sometimes a person's death causes ripples far greater than their life ever could. The crowd that witnessed Joan's disappearance into the flames in the square of Rouen had not only seen the last moments of a prisoner, but also the birth of a hero whose memory would be etched into the heart of a nation. Joan's ashes may have been scattered into the Seine, but her memory began to burn like an unquenchable fire in the hearts of the French people. She was no longer just a peasant girl or a soldier. She had become a divine symbol of the people's struggle for freedom, a savior sent by God, and a martyr. Joan's death left a deep mark on the collective memory of the French people. The stories of those who had been present in the square that day spread from mouth to mouth and turned into legend. People spoke of her courage, her faith, and her unwavering will. Some claimed to have seen a dove rise from the flames, believing it to be a sign that Joan's soul had ascended to God. Others spoke of how, in her final breath, she gazed up at the sky and died peacefully, like an angel. These stories transformed Joan in the minds of the people into not just a hero, but a sacred figure. Joan's death became a turning point for the French resistance. Her courage and sacrifice lifted the morale of the people and fueled their anger against the English occupation. Songs, prayers, and stories honoring Joan's life and death spread across France. Her name echoed in village squares, churches, and even on the battlefield, becoming a call to hope and resistance. For the French people, mentioning Joan's name became a duty. Keeping her memory alive became part of the fight for freedom. However, Joan's impact was not limited to the common folk. Her story also left a profound effect on the French nobility and royal family. King Charles VII could not ignore Joan's sacrifice. As a king who owed his throne to her, he felt compelled to honor her memory. Years after her death, Charles VII established a commission to revisit the trial of Joan. This not only cleared her name, but also marked the first step toward recognizing her as a saint. Joan's story eventually became an inseparable part of France's national identity. She was not just a military leader, but also an inspiration. Her name became a symbol of the struggle for independence and freedom. Even centuries later, Joan's story continued to give courage and hope to the French people during their darkest times. Prayers were said in her name in churches, statues were erected, and festivals were held in her honor. In 1920, when the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint, it once again demonstrated that her story was not only an inspiration to the French people, but to the entire world. But, my dear friends, How did this process of Joan's transformation into a legend, beginning after her death, change the course of history? How did her memory play a role in France's struggle against the English? And how did the fire she sparked with her faith become a light for future generations? Well, in the next chapter, we will explore how Joan's legacy guided France to victory and how it led to the rebirth of a nation. Ah, my dear listeners, history's scales of justice sometimes work slowly, but in the end, they reveal the truth. The years following Joan of Arc's disappearance into the flames did not only serve to amplify her memory, but also triggered a great quest for justice in the hearts of the people. This young woman, hailed as France's savior, had been unjustly convicted in a biased trial and sent to her death, a tragedy that would be remembered as a disgrace. But this story did not end there. The suffering she endured in life was balanced by the honor she received after her death. About 25 years after Joan's death, France was in a very different place. The English, having been driven out largely by the resistance Joan had sparked, were no longer a significant force in the country, and France's unity had been restored. King Charles VII, the king whom Joan had saved, was now firmly on his throne. However, in the shadow of this victory, the question of Joan's trial and execution was still being debated. The people believed she was not a traitor, but a chosen servant of God. It was at this point that King Charles VII's conscience and political calculations came into play. In 1449, when Rouen was taken from the English, records from the trial of Joan were uncovered. These records clearly demonstrated how biased and unjust the trial had been. The charges against Joan seemed crafted to tarnish her military successes and diminish her influence over the people. In response, King Charles VII established a commission to reopen Joan's case. In 1455, with the permission of Pope Calixtus III, an official process was initiated to overturn her trial. During this process, Joan's surviving relatives, witnesses, and people who had lived during her time were heard. Her courage, faith, and her fight against the English were once again brought to light. The contradictions in the trial records and the baseless nature of the charges against her were revealed, particularly the accusation of heresy based on Joan wearing men's clothing, something that had been necessary for her protection on the battlefield, revealed just how political this trial had been. Throughout, Joan had never strayed from her faith in God. In 1456, exactly 25 years after Joan's death, the verdict was delivered. Joan of Arc was exonerated from all charges. The court acknowledged that she had been sent to her death as part of a political game serving the English. This ruling not only cleared Joan's name, but also solidified her status as a hero and divine figure. During this process, Joan's story grew even more, and in the eyes of the people, she was now not only a savior, but also a martyr and saint. Yet Joan's story did not end there. Centuries later, in 1920, the Catholic Church officially canonized Joan of Arc as a saint. This was a sign that her faith and sacrifice had gained universal recognition. Joan had now become a sacred figure not just for France, but for the entire Christian world. Prayers made in her name, statues erected in her honor, and festivals celebrated in her memory all served as a reminder of how deep her legacy truly ran. But, my dear friends, after this great victory, there's a question we must ask. Did Joan's memory remain merely that of a saint, or does it continue to teach us something about courage and faith, even in the modern world? Let's explore together the lasting effects of her story, which still resonate with us today.
Ah, my dear friends, we've come to the end of our story, but the legacy of Joan of Arc continues to defy time and live on to this very day. Her life is a unique lesson in how an ordinary peasant girl can change the fate of a nation. Joan, the embodiment of courage, faith, and sacrifice, has been an inspiration not just in her own time, but for centuries to come. So, what does the life of this young woman tell us today? Let's reflect on that question together. Joan's story shows us how courage can shine like a light, even in the darkest moments. She was a soldier, armed with a sword on the battlefield, but her strongest weapon was her faith. She risked everything to fulfill what she believed was her divine mission. Fearlessly, she faced her enemies, fought those who belittled her, and even when her own people doubted her, she never strayed from her path. This courage wasn't just physical strength, it was a determination that came from deep within her soul. Joan reminds us of the importance of overcoming our fears and staying steadfast on the path we know is right. Her sacrifice offers another lesson. Joan gave her life for the salvation of a nation. She wasn't after personal gain or fame. Her mission was to fight for the freedom and unity of the French people. This sacrifice represents one of humanity's highest virtues. Joan's story shows us how we can transcend ourselves and work for a cause greater than ourselves. Her sacrifice serves as a powerful example, one that leaves a lasting mark on all of our lives. And perseverance. Ah, Joan's perseverance is legendary. Despite her youth, she never gave up in the face of any difficulty. Neither mocking words, nor the harshness of the battlefield, nor the trial that led her to her death could break her spirit. She clung fiercely to her dreams and faith. This perseverance shows us how to resist the challenges we may face in life. Joan teaches us that after every fall, we must rise again, for true victory lies in never giving up. But Joan's legacy isn't just about individual virtues. She became a figure who shaped the identity of a nation, a hero for France, a saint for the Christian world, and an inspiring icon for the world. Her story transcends boundaries and time, touching all of us. Joan reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, there is always light, and that justice and hope are never truly lost. My dear friends, Joan of Arc's life speaks to us from the dusty pages of history. Through her courage, we question our own fears. Through her sacrifice, we challenge our selfishness. And through her perseverance, we reconsider our indecisiveness. So, what lessons will we take from this story? In today's world, will we show the courage and determination to carry on Joan's spirit? The answer to that question lies in each of our own stories. And so, my dear friends, we come to the end of one story. But remember, in every corner of history, there's another story waiting for us. Who knows which hero or which age will open its doors next? I look forward to meeting you again to discover that together. For now, farewell, and let the journey illuminated by Joan's light leave a mark on your heart.